This morning, I would like to talk about the stories that shape the way we view and interpret the lives of refugees. For most of us, what we know about refugees comes only from the media. These are the images that we are shown daily. What happens when we see these images? What stories do we tell? This is their problem. They need to solve it themselves. I would never risk my family's life by putting them on a boat. There's too many. We can't help them. What if they are terrorists? We don't have enough resources to take care of our own needs. We tell the story in a way that distances ourselves from them. The story that I often hear rising up in people's hearts when they talk about refugees is a story of fear. Why is our society so afraid of refugees and immigrants? Has the fear that gripped them seeped into the hearts of our church, seeped into our hearts? 1 John tells us that there is no fear in love, but that perfect love drives out all fear. If we allow fear instead of love to grip us, then we will forget our story. Let me remind you. Our story begins with the emphatic declaration that God created humanity in God's own image, and it was supremely good. If we are followers of the God who started the story with Genesis 1, then we must discipline our thoughts, our actions, our speech, and our story in a way of love for the sacredness, the imago Dei, of every human being. We must be wholeheartedly for and never against people. If we say that we are the people of the God of Israel, then our story is a story of migration and exodus. We are a people who are called to remember that we were slaves and immigrants in the land of Egypt, but our God liberated us from our oppressors as we crossed the sea parted before our eyes. And our story does not end there. When we thought that God had forgotten and abandoned us once again in Egypt, God becomes a human, and the story changes forever. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus tells the final story of grace and forgiveness for all that is broken in ourselves and in our world. The grand narrative of Scripture is about a God who persistently and passionately reaches towards the forgotten, the oppressed, and the other with a hope for restoration. This is the story that should shape the way we view refugees. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to tell you my story. I am not a refugee, but my friendships with refugees have been one of the greatest gifts of my life. In 2012, 5 friends from seminary and I moved to Indonesia to work in an immigration prison. The prison was locking up refugees from Afghanistan, Myanmar, Iran, and Sri Lanka. They had all attempted the desperate journey by boat to seek asylum in Australia. They got caught in Indonesian waters and placed in a prison, waiting to be processed by the United Nations. I will never forget the first time I walked through the door that separated my free world from their prison. A flood of grief and confusion, of love and peace flowed over me. I was greeted one by kind but desperate faces that carried stories of loss and of hope. I was confronted with the cruelty of our world and, in a mysterious way, the tender love of God. I realized pretty quickly that sentimentality was useless. What was required was an opening of my heart in vulnerability to people who over time became my dear friends. To be a friend was to let them tell me their stories, who they are, what kind of world they have lived in, and what their hopes are. Do you know what I heard? I heard stories of tremendous pain, of loss, and of tragedy. And I heard stories of hope, of hopes for a place to belong, to raise children in freedom, to enjoy friends and family, and to work with dignity. What made us the same we had the same hopes. And what made us different? Their lives had called for a far greater courage and strength than mine had required. I want to show you pictures of friends who are very dear to me. They are all refugees. Out of respect, I will not be showing any pictures of women. Please look into their faces and hear their stories. This is Rajab and little Omid. Rajab was forced to flee his home in Afghanistan when he was a young man. He is an innocent man, but spent most of his life in prison as a refugee. When I first met little Omid, he was clearly suffering from the trauma of having lived most of his life in a prison. Rajab and his wife and little Omid are part of the less than 1% of refugees who are resettled. They now live in Australia. This is Omid and Mahdi. They are cousins. While they grew up together, their families were separated in Indonesia. Mahdi's family was granted refugee resettlement in Australia, and Omid's family was denied it. They wait daily for the news of deportation back to Afghanistan, the country that made them refugees. This is Nive. His family fled Sri Lanka during the Tamil massacre. I met Nive in the prison when he was only 14. He told me that he wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up. Nive is now 17 and still lives in the prison, waiting for the United Nations to process his family's case. After we left, he took up the task of teaching the children math, English, and science. This is Reza. Like Rajab, Reza spent most of his life in prison as a refugee. He met Jesus in prison. Although the United Nations granted Reza refugee status, Australia and Sweden rejected his case for refugee resettlement because he had hepatitis C. Reza died this year in Indonesia. This is Ramazan. Ramazan is one of the gentlest men I have ever known. He lived in a remote village in the mountains of Afghanistan that was occupied by the Taliban. He fled his village in the middle of the winter, having to leave his young pregnant wife with their family in hopes that he would later be reunited with them in safety. Ramazan is also among the few resettled in Australia. He has never met his daughter, as they are still waiting for the United Nations to process his wife's case. And this is Hamid. Hamid is from Afghanistan. He is the youngest of 11 children. We used to call him the camp manager because he spoke so many languages and acted like an ambassador between the Indonesian guards and the refugee families. Hamid now lives in Australia and works as a caretaker for the elderly. If you forget everything that I have said this morning, I only ask that you remember these faces when you hear the word refugee.